could sell.
Sorry about that.
Okay. So even though they didn't write congregational melodies as such, they never sat down like Israel Goldfarb did and said, I'm going to write something that Jews in the pews can sing. Their music has in some sense entered the folk tradition, and their influence has lasted in the decades, the nearly 2 centuries since they started composing. And we hear their music even today in our own services. So tonight, we are going to meet Solomon Sulzer and Louis Lewandowski, whom my fellow congregants in England, the ones in the choir I used to sing with, referred to him as Big Louis. So we're going to meet Solly and Big Louis. So of the two of them, Solomon Sulzer is probably the more famous, ultimately. He, certainly during his lifetime, he commanded a great deal of cultural influence. He was not an obscure composer. He was an elite, highly connected, extremely politically involved musician who really took advantage of radical new technology and new political philosophies to transform how people conceived of the sound of the synagogue. So first, let's find out who he is. Let's see, where have we got here? All right, can everybody see my screen here? I've got a bunch of pictures. So we can see that. So we've got 4 photos, none of these are I think one of them might be a photograph. We've got 4 pictures of Solomon Sulzer. You can see that in his youth, over in these 2 pictures, he was an unbelievably fashionable man. I mean, he was not, can everybody see the screen now? Yes, good. He was a very fashionable man. This picture, this 3rd picture, we'll come back to this one. There's a reason that he's dressed like that. And this is probably the most famous picture of him. And then as you can see, he lived to a ripe old age, and this is him in that ripe old age. So you've seen him now. We'll take you back here. So he was born, like I said, in 1804. He was born in a town called Hohenems, which is in the country today called Austria. Although when he was born, it was going through this kind of hot minute where it was both the Holy Roman Empire and the Austrian Empire at the same time. The Holy Roman Empire was coming to an end, and the Austrian Empire was taking its place. So it's now modern Austria. And it's important to Sulzer's story to remember that he was born in Austria, in this region. He spoke German, but he was not born in any of the German states. So, and when he was born, his name wasn't Solomon Sulzer. He was born Solomon Levy, and his family changed their name to Sulzer in 1813. I'm not entirely sure why they did this at that time, but they did. The family had moved to Hohenems in 1748, and they had moved to Hohenems from a town called Zolz, and that's where they got the name Sulzer from. And there's a story that when he was just little Solly, when he was about 2 or 3 years old, Solomon Sulzer fell into a river. And this was a very fast mountain river in the Alps, and he was just barely pulled out before he was either drowned or swept away by the current. And his mother, who was not the kind of person who would say upon her child being rescued, he had a hat. His mother, who was not that kind of person, decided that this was a miracle and she was going to dedicate this child's life to divine service. And as he grew up, Solomon Sulzer showed a real talent for music. And if you've been dedicated to divine service and you have a talent for music, what happens is that you get apprenticed to local cantors. And that was where Sulzer began his musical training. So he was trained, he studied with several very famous Swiss and Austrian cantors, and he took over the position of the cantor in his synagogue in Hohenems in 1820, and he was just 16 years old at that point. So you can kind of see that he was a prodigy. At 16, he was good enough to do this. So what we're going to do, it's 1820 now, Sulzer is 16 years old, and we're going to zoom out a little bit. We're going to zoom out of Hohenems. And we're going to look at the Jewish world in Central Europe at the time and what was going on. At this point in the early 19th century, the philosophy and the aesthetic of the Enlightenment was sort of giving way to the Romantic era. You were starting to see less of this very brilliant musical style like Mozart. You're starting to see something a little heavier, a little richer, a little fuller sound, this romantic sound. So the aesthetic of the Enlightenment is becoming the Romantic era. But the social and political ideas of the Enlightenment are still spreading across Europe. So, and we're talking about new ideas of nationhood, new concepts of citizenship, and new ideas of what it would mean to be a nation and then to belong to that nation. And for the Jews, what this meant was political emancipation. The Jews became full citizens of the countries in which they lived. And this sort of took place in waves across Europe. So France was the first. France was in the end of the 18th century around the French Revolution. The German states started doing this maybe 10, 15 years later, the beginning of the 19th century. The Austrian Empire didn't fully emancipate its Jewish citizens until 1867. But the ideas of the Enlightenment were starting to filter even into Vienna. And around the early 19th century, there were about 150 really, really wealthy, really select Jewish families who were living in Vienna. And they lived here because in 1782, Emperor Joseph II, who was Holy Roman Emperor at that point, Joseph II, issued an Edict of Tolerance, which was very liberal for the time. And it said that, you know, if you were a Jew and you met a certain income threshold, you could live in Vienna, which was the capital. And this was a great privilege. So this Jewish elite, remember that full citizenship didn't happen until 1867. So this elite of 150 families was Sulzer's primary congregation once he moved to Vienna. So Joseph's nephew, Franz II, who was both Franz II he's the second of Holy Roman Empire, but he was Franz I of the Austrian Empire, because remember it changed. He presided over the construction of an official city synagogue, the Vienna Stadttempel. It's also called the Seitenstättengasse Temple because it's on Seitenstättengasse in Vienna. And the construction started in 1824 and it finished in 1826. And we're going to take a look at this. This is the Seitenstättengasse Temple. It's still there. They still have services there. So one thing that you can see about the official city temple of Vienna is that it's in a little teeny tiny street. It's in a Gasse, it's basically an alleyway. And that's not an accident. The reason is that Joseph II, the same emperor who issued the Edict of Tolerance in the first place, he also issued a law that said in Vienna, which is a very Catholic city, that only Roman Catholic churches could face major public city streets. So that meant that the Stadttemple and any Lutheran churches in the city all had to be on these very narrow side streets. But this synagogue, when it was finished in 1826, they hired Solomon Sulzer, who's all of 22 years old at that point, to be their Chazan. And he stayed with them for the rest of his life. When they hired him, he was already getting to be kind of a rock star. He had a very, very good baritone voice. He had an increasingly serious musical education. Once he moved to Vienna, he was able to study with a lot of very, very skilled and very, very influential musicians in the city. And he put both of these ideas to work. He put his voice to work and he put his musical education to work. We would not today call him an adherent of a reform movement. There was a reform movement in Germany happening at this point. It was extremely iconoclastic. It was a very radical ideological movement. This movement didn't reach into Vienna, but these 150 tolerated Jewish families really wanted to prove that they were part of the elite, they were part of the upper crust, that they could behave with all of the dignity and decorum that elite families in Vienna might be expected to behave with. And working with Sulzer, they developed what was called the Vienna Rite at the Stadttempel. And it was a very hierarchical sound, it was very choral sound. The idea was that the congregation should sit still and listen to the beautiful music and be very decorous. So it was a very similar aesthetic to German high reform, but without the ideology behind it. And one of the things that Solomon Sulzer, one of the things that he instituted, he really, really did not like the idea of apprenticeship training. He'd been trained by apprenticeship. He didn't like the way that that worked. He didn't really like the sound of, a cantor being supported by an adult bass and then a young boy who was learning. These singers were called misharim, and they would provide voices, they provide harmonic support, but they weren't quite a choir. And Sulzer really wanted a choir. So he expanded this idea, this very traditional idea of a chazan with a bas and a mesharer into a choir, a full trained choir singing in 4-part harmony. And of course, the congregation did not need to be involved. Sulzer was a man with a certain amount of ego, and this was going to be his show. So hang on a second. So I also said that he had a certain amount of social power as well. We'll talk about this a little bit later. Sulzer's choir did not include women. Sulzer's choir would have had pre-adolescent boys singing the soprano and alto lines. Women didn't sing in Catholic churches in Vienna, and women did not sing in the Stadttempel. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Sulzer was with it. He was kind of a party boy. He was the equivalent of some guy who loved fast cars. In his case, he loved fast horses. He loved riding them down the mountains at speed. And he also loved new technology. And the technology that he was really enamored of was cheap music printing. We'd figured out at that point really how to publish sheet music, how to print it really efficiently, and how to print multiple copies that could be sold cheaply. And this helped composers to spread their music. It helped them to make a living from their music. It helped to make them less dependent on either a royal court or some other form of patronage, because they could write and sell their own music. It really democratized access to music, even though it also tended to make musicians a little bit more dependent on notation. I mean, once you've got this easy to read thing in front of you, you start to become dependent on it. So between roughly 1838 and 1840, Sulzer published the first volume. There would eventually be a second volume in about 1865 of this monumental collection of synagogue music that's called Shir Tzion. So we'll take a look at that here. So this is the cover page of volume 1 of Shir Tzion, Gesänge der Israeliten, Songs of the Israelites. And you could just buy this. Much of the music in it was his own composition, although he did also commission other really prominent European composers to contribute works. So you'll see a couple of works in Shir Tzion by Franz Schubert, who was a great friend and a great admirer of Sulzer. And also in Shir Tzion, we will find what is probably Solomon Sulzer's most enduring composition. You are going to recognize this, although it's not going to sound quite the way that we sing it at BEKI. So we're getting ready for our first musical example.
Rachel, it's not really working.
We can't, Rachel, it's not coming through.
Not coming through. Oh dear, this is why I wish we had been able to do a sound check beforehand. All right. All right, so share sound. We'll go back and rewind this. Let me know if you can hear this.
No, not really.
No, it's kind of in and out.
Okay, I'm not 100% sure what to do here. Computer audio.
I know you sing this really well. I heard enough to know what it is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what I want you to hear is the choral version of it. So this is our Ein Kamocha. I'm going to try it one more time. Let's see. Do we share screen? We're going to share sound, computer audio.
So can I suggest you just try playing it without playing it through the computer audio? But just play it the way we're hearing your voice. What happens if you just play it?
Well, we will find out. All right, so we are not sharing.
Okay, and I have one more suggestion. Is it possible to put a link in the chat that and give us each a minute to listen to it ourselves?
I will, what I can do at the end of this is I'll put the sound files in the chat.
Mhm.
Let me see if I can get these sound files here. Let's see. Sorry about this. Let's see, my computer. See, yeah, the problem is that some of them are fairly large and they're not all YouTube files. So yes, that's the whole Torah service that Sulzer composed. And if you listen to it, you'll hear that the first minute or so up to Av HaRachamim is very familiar to us. We use part of his Torah service. So it is the most recognizable Ein Kamocha in the world. The Ein Kamocha is really what I wanted you to hear. If you wake up a moderately observant Jewish person at about 3 in the morning and say, sing Ein Kamocha, one of two things will happen. Either that person will punch you in the nose or they'll sing this Ein Kamocha. And I only wanted you to listen to the first minute because we don't do Sulzer's Av HaRachamim. The one that we do sing, that will turn up next week. By the way, can you all hear me? Okay, good. This is fine. And if you listen to this piece, you'll be able to hear what Sulzer was about as a cantor. You can kind of hear that, you know, he's the soloist and the choir is sort of in the background and they're supporting him. And they're not going to have a whole lot of fireworks whatever they do. And you know, Sulzer was an amazing solo singer. He really he had an ego, but he kind of earned it. He was friends with musicians like Schubert, Robert Schumann, and Franz Liszt. They would all come to Vienna. They'd actually go to services at his synagogue to hear him. Schubert even wrote a setting of Psalm 92, especially for Sulzer. And of course, Sulzer commissioned Schubert to write some music for Shir Tzion. Sulzer was very much into choir music. He spent part of his time for a while. He had a day job at the Vienna Conservatory as a music professor and as the director of their men's choir. So his natural thing to do is to compose music for a brilliant solo chazan backed up by a choir that was trained to sing in a very Western style choral sound. And we're going to try another example, where we'll see if the folly continues. Let's see. Let's see if we can hear this.
Still not working.
All right, it looks like we are having sound sharing problems in general. So
The last little part came through.
yeah, I kind of like the whole thing to come through. That's kind of the issue.
Do you want to do again where you posted in chat and then you just pause for a moment and we all listen on our own?
That's exactly what I am doing. So I'm sending you another audio file. And if you'd like to listen to maybe about half of it, the choir doesn't come in until the end. I'll give you a few minutes on that. Let me know if you guys can play that file.
Did you just try posting a second audio file?
No, let me try that again.
Oh, you accidentally direct messaged me, Rachel.
Yeah, sorry. Let's see. We are looking for the Sulzer. All right. Let's see if we can, does everybody have his Hashkivenu? If somebody could just let me know if it's working for you. Good.
Rachel, it's possible that screen sharing might fix it. If you screen shared rather than sound shared, I don't know if that's.
All right, we'll try that for the next one. So at this point, now you have this piece of music. You can kind of hear this isn't a Hashkivenu that we would want to use in a synagogue today, even in a synagogue that has a dedicated cantor. It's a little slow, it's a little formal, it's a little distant. This is really music that's meant for a star chazan with backup. The other thing, and yes, Sarah, it is extremely operatic. If Sulzer had not been dedicated to the cantorate when he was like 3, he might well have become an opera singer. It was not out of the question at the time. Both of these recordings, as we talked about earlier, they're very modern interpretations, which you can tell because both of them have women as soloists. Sulzer's music, it can be very grand, it can be very dramatic. You know, remember that his musical education took place largely in Vienna. His cantorial education, Marga, I will have to look that up for you a little bit later on. His cantorial education was by apprenticeship, but his musical education really did take place in Vienna. And Vienna was a Roman Catholic city. So the aesthetic of Sulzer sort of combines this sort of late 18th and early 19th century Hazanis, this sort of aesthetic of a grand voice leading the service, with the Western harmony and this sort of really Catholic drama that he learned from living in Vienna and from palling around with, you know, high city officials. And so for Jewish communities that were struggling with modernity was kind of, it was hard for everyone. And Jewish communities struggled with how to integrate as much as the host communities struggled with how to integrate them. And one, you know, how do you retain Jewishness while being modern? This was sort of the big question for the Jews in the 19th century. And in a sense, what Sulzer gave was a demonstration of how Jewish communities could resolve these two questions, these tensions between this very old-fashioned or very Eastern European heritage and the aesthetics of this modern Western and Central European world that they were being invited into. Sulzer was wildly influential in everything that he did. We're going to go back to the pictures, which I'm fairly sure work. So can everybody see two pictures of Solomon Sulzer? Yes. So this picture, which I said would come back, it has, along with another one of him dressed fairly similarly. Look at his clothes. You've probably seen older pictures of Hazanim who were dressed sort of like this, you know, in very formal robes, maybe with a hat. It's called a mitre. He was the one who started it. This was an outfit that when he first put it on would have been worn by a Catholic priest. And he was wearing these robes in order to enhance the status of the Chazan and announce that the Chazan was a professional clergy person who was entitled to as much respect from both his congregation and from his city as a Catholic priest. So synagogues across Europe that wanted to embrace modernism, not necessarily reform, but a certain modern aesthetic, they would adopt choirs and they called them choral synagogues. The word choral synagogue used to designate a synagogue that was modern and kind of with it. And the chazanim of these synagogues, the cantors, would dress like Sulzer. They would imitate the robes that he wore. And there was this whole fashion for Zulzerism, for being like Sulzer. So we'll stop the share. And ultimately, as influential as he was, we don't actually sing that much of his music. The other big thing, aside from parts of the Torah service, which you have and you can listen to at your leisure, is the Aleinu, the Aleinu that we sing every week. Very few people have even attempted to write another Aleinu. William Sharlin did at one point, but it's not either as good or as accessible. Sulzer's Aleinu is still the gold standard. The Shema also, for a long time, people thought that the Shema was Sulzer's, you know, da 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 da. That was known as the Sulzer Shema for years and years and years. And recently we've discovered that it's not by him, and we'll actually find out next week who we think might have written it. In this post-Goldfarb era that we live in, we are less into the idea of a very decorous solo chazan and choir and the congregation, you know, kind of smiles and nods along than we used to be. And that was, most of Sulzer's music is aimed for that kind of service. But he really did set up a foundation for the concept that, you know, not the way that we execute it today, but for the concept of Jewish worship made up of melodies composed in a Western style. And what he proved was that there could be something Jewish about that you could go to a service like this and you could listen to beautiful Western choral harmony and it would still feel Jewish. You know, Sulzer was an elitist. His music is about the Chazan. He was an elitist. He wanted to show off. And so it took another composer. I don't know if Sulzer would have sung with such a heavy vibrato. Vibrato really came into fashion during the 19th century. He might have picked it up later on. I think in the beginning of his career, he wouldn't, but he might have towards the end. So we're going to move on from Sulzer. We're going to move on to Lewandowski. He was working on similar principles in a different Germanophone country, and he really brought choral sound and composed services to a new level. So we're going to take a look again at some pictures. So here we have a couple of pictures of Lewandowski. We have a picture of him as a young man. This was probably painted in the 1840s or 1850s, towards his middle age, as an older man. And I really wanted to show you this picture of his tombstone because it has a very lovely inscription on it, which I'm not sure if you can read because it's a little small. It says, you know, unsere geliebten Eltern, our beloved parents, Louis und Helena Lewandowski, Liebe macht das Lied unsterblich. Love makes the melody immortal, which is a lovely thing to have on your tombstone if you're a musician. So I just wanted to show you some pictures of him. So he was born in a part of the Kingdom of Prussia. So at that time, Prussia is not quite the borders of modern Germany. So this was a part of Prussia that is currently in Poland. And in 1833, when he was about 12 years old, he was orphaned by that point. He went to Berlin, which was the capital of Prussia. It later became the capital of Germany. He went to Berlin to study music, and he was at a music school. He specialized in piano and voice, and he ended up being a soloist at a local synagogue near where he was living. And at some point, probably in his late teens or early 20s, he met Alexander Mendelssohn. Alexander was a cousin of Felix and Fanny Mendelssohn, who are the composers that we all know. The Mendelssohn family was enormous. It was very, very wealthy, very influential. They were sort of the Prussian equivalents of the 150 tolerated Jewish families in Vienna. And so Alexander Mendelssohn thought that Lewandowski was pretty good, and I'm fairly sure that his cousin Felix confirmed it and said, yes, this kid's got talent, he's going places. And Alexander sponsored Lewandowski and helped him to become the first Jewish student at the Berlin Academy of Composition. So Lewandowski isn't quite as elite as Sulzer, but he also has very, very serious training in Western music. And during his time at the music school, he went to a cantorial concert and he was just blown away by how beautiful this was. And he was so impressed that he decided to take all the skills that he was learning at the Berlin Academy of Composition and turn them to use in the synagogue. So he was not going to compose symphonies. He wasn't going to compose operas or chamber music. He was going to compose for synagogues. So Sulzer was a cantor, and Lewandowski ended up being a choir director, and that's very important for how we hear their music. In 1844, he was hired at the Old Synagogue in Berlin. He was hired as their choir director, not as a cantor. And he, of course, would conduct Sulzer's arrangements, because remember, Sulzer had published his music, and this was the great new technology that in Berlin, you could have music that was composed in Vienna, and you could sing it in Berlin without the composer ever having to be there. And Lewandowski, I think, was probably inspired by this, as well as by the cantorial concert that he heard. It was pretty clear there was an example of someone who could compose choral music for the synagogue. And Lewandowski also started composing. And in 1866, we'll have another photograph here. In 1866, the new synagogue was built. It was constructed. It's still there. It's on Oranienburger Straße. The facade of it is still there. It was bombed during the war. When the new synagogue is built, they hired Lewandowski away from the old synagogue as their musical director. So he went from being just the choir director to being the main musical director in 1866. And the new synagogue, this place really was a Reform synagogue. And so they gave him two really important things. They gave him access to an organ, and they gave him permission. Yes, yeah, great. It's a Masorti congregation now, smallish, but it's there. It really was a Reform synagogue back in the day. So they gave him an organ, and they gave him permission to be pretty experimental. And it was at this synagogue that Lewandowski really developed his signature style. So his style is really romantic. There's lots of influence. You can hear the influence of Felix Mendelssohn. It's designed for a choir with a cantorial soloist. So the cantorial parts are smaller. The choir has a bigger role. So Lewandowski's solution to the problem that Sulzer solved, the problem of how to combine a sense of Jewishness and a sense of modernity, is to give the soloist this sort of Chazan-like style, and then to have the choir sing in a more Western style. So you have a Jewish Chazan being backed up by a Western sounding choir. And we have a piece of Lewandowski that we absolutely love. I'm going to try to do this by sharing my screen now. I'll tell you what it is in case it doesn't work. This is Zacharti Lach that the quartet will sing on the High Holy Days. So we're going to try one more time. And we are going to, okay, can you all see my music app? Okay, let's see if we can hear it as well. So hang on a second, stop share. So they're singing this really, really slowly, and we've all heard this. We don't need to hear all of it, but you can hear at that point the difference between the way the Chazan sounds, the way the soloist is sounding, and then the way the choir sounds. So this is Lewandowski saying you can have both together. He's also really good at tone painting. And I want you to listen to a little bit. You've probably heard this piece. This is Hallelujah, his setting of the 150th Psalm, which is almost an exercise in lovely tone painting, using sound to illustrate the meaning of the text. And what I want you to listen to here is Beteka shofar, the sound of the trumpet really comes out. The tziltzilim, their finger symbols, betziltzilei shema, betziltzilei truah, the way that he does that. We'll listen to a few minutes of Hallelujah.
Hallelujah, hallelujah.
And we'll pause it at this rather dramatic juncture in the piece of music. You probably know this piece, but you can see he understands what this psalm is about, and he understands that it's about individual instruments, and he's bringing them out. So this was, he really was a very good choral composer. And he's also very clever in his use of the organ. Remember that the Oranienburger Straße synagogue was a very, very reformed synagogue at the time, and they had an organ. It was a serious point of contention for 19th century synagogues. Essentially, having an organ meant that you were ideologically aligned with the German reform movement and that you were rich enough to have an organ. Lewandowski really loved the organ, but he also wanted his music to be accessible, by which read marketable, to synagogues that didn't have them, either because they hadn't really come over to reform ideology, or because they couldn't afford it, or they didn't have a place to play it. So none of his organ parts are obligato. They enhance the piece. If you listen to Lewandowski played with the organ, it sounds wonderful and it sounds grand, and you'll hear very long organ introductions to his pieces and conclusions. But once the singing starts, the only thing the organ does is double the choir. So the organ will make the choir sound richer. It might help fill up the space. But as you can hear from the fact that we just played an a cappella Lewandowski, the harmony is all there in his music, and you don't need the organ to add anything to it. The harmony stands on its own. So he, like Sulzer, also published his music. He published two major collections, and we'll look at their title pages. No, we're going to look at this. So he published these two volumes. Kol Rina Utefila was published in 1871. And Toda V'Zimra ended up in two parts. They were published in 1876 and 1883. So Kol Rina Utefila, the first volume, contains 1 and 2 voice arrangements for the choir of sort of older synagogue melodies. Lewandowski isn't quite ready to publish all of his own compositions yet, so he's sort of harmonizing older melodies that he knows. And then Toda V'Zimra gets more daring with his, and he's really writing 4-part harmony now. He's using his own compositions. He's mixing choir and soloist. And unlike Sulzer, Lewandowski, he did come around to writing for a mixed voice choir. Women did sing in his choir. His soprano and alto parts towards the end of his career are designed to be sung by women. In the early part of his career, he was only writing for male voices. Zacharti Lach actually comes from this early part of his career. And if you look at the original setting, it's for 2 tenors and 2 basses. And adapting it for mixed voice choir can be a bit of a challenge. But the Neue Synagoge was quite progressive for gender as well as for ideology and music. So they would allow women to sing in the choir. And because of this, because the new synagogue was much more associated with reform ideology, their relationship with the Hebrew language was a little bit more distant. The early reformers really didn't want any Hebrew in the services. And by about 1845, Hebrew had come back, but they were always a little bit, they liked having the vernacular in the service. And Lewandowski did write some music for them that was in German, the same way that we might have songs, Debbie Friedman wrote a lot in English, and Louis Lewandowski wrote quite a lot in German. And you almost never hear his German language music sung today. First of all, because it's in German, and German-speaking congregations are much rarer than they used to be on both sides of the Atlantic. And second, because this music was in German, it never really had a chance to enter the folk tradition as widely as the music that Lewandowski would sing in Hebrew. And when choirs started to lose popularity in synagogues, all of Lewandowski's German music went with it. And all of which is to say that the last recording that I'm going to play for you is a very, very rare recording. This is a very short piece that Lewandowski wrote for Shabbat Rosh Chodesh, which doesn't happen every month, but when Rosh Chodesh falls on Shabbat, this is the piece that you would bring out for it. The text is from the Haftarah. It's from Isaiah. Your sun will never set again. Your moon will wane no more. The Lord will be your everlasting light. That's in the Haftarah for Shabbat Rosh Chodesh. You can look it up. And Danielle Padley, who is the director of Kol Echad, the English choir that I sang with, found this piece and she taught it to Kol Echad over Zoom. And I've been joining their Zoom rehearsal, so I got to learn it along with them. She started teaching it last year, and back in the spring, England had enough of a COVID lull that Kol Echad could start rehearsing outdoors, where they'd plug in a laptop and put it on a somebody's lawn chair, so I could sing along with them. They were gathered someone in someone's backyard, and the first time they did this, Danielle said, "Can we sing this piece on Shabbat?" And they sang it well enough together. So it's the first time they'd actually sung it together. And they sang it well enough that Danielle decided to record it with her phone right there in the backyard. So this is not the world's most polished recording of this piece. It starts with 10 seconds of silence and a bird chirp because Danielle put down her phone and then darted backwards all the way across the lawn just in case. So it'll start 10 seconds in. And as far as any of us know, it's the only recording of this piece that we've ever heard of. We don't think there's another recording of this piece. So I really hope that we'll be able to hear this. You hear some bird song there. So that is a piece of Lewandowski that is almost never heard because it's in German and because German kind of dropped out of the world as a language of synagogue services for quite a while. But it's a beautiful piece of music. You are now among the privileged few to have ever heard this piece since about 1840. So we don't use as much Lewandowski in our Shabbat services as we do Zolzer, but you have probably sung more Lewandowski than you think. I'm going to sing you the last tune that I have for you because I think you'll recognize this piece. This is also a Lewandowski piece. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu. B'shabbat kodsha b'ahava uvratzon hinhilanu, zikaron l'maaseh v'reshit. Ki hu yom techila mikra'e kodesh, zecher l'tziat Mitzrayim. Ki vanu v'acharta, yotanu kidashta, mikol hamim, b'shabbat kodshecha, b'yava ratzon inchaltanu Baruch atah Adonai mekadesh haShabbat is another great Big Louie tune that I think we all know. So Big Louie really has entered our lives the way that Sulzer has. And you can see how both of them, both Lewandowski and Sulzer, Big Louie and Solly, they changed the sound of the synagogue. Neither of them invented the concept of a synagogue choir, but they reimagined what a synagogue choir could do, and they helped square the circle between sounding modern and Western and sounding Jewish. They took advantage of this new technology of cheap music publication. They spread their compositions around. And the most important thing was that they were good composers. You know, they wrote good music and people liked it and people picked it up, and their music was singable. People just liked singing it. It was accessible. And even after choirs sort of dropped out of fashion, people adapted Sulzer's and Lewandowski's music for congregational singing. This is choral music that became congregational melodies. And their compositions really kind of form the backbones of a lot of Western synagogue services. And even if we don't remember that they were originally composed as choral music by these very elite, highly trained Western trained musicians, yes, people also note Sadiq Katamar. There's so much, we could just play an hour of Lewandowski here. This reconception, the way that synagogue music was, that they reconceived it, this laid the foundation for the kind of accomplished cantors in the first half of the 20th century, like Israel Goldfarb, to be able to compose in this accessible Western style that sounded Jewish, and to be able to reach congregations, to give congregations something to sing. So next week, we're actually going to look at the work that Young Israel and the Jewish Theological Seminary did to collect and inspire and arrange, and in some cases commission new work from cantors to really build the idea of congregational melodies. So we're basically out of time. I apologize for the tech problems. I think we've got everything figured out. Maybe Shoshana, if we can get on 10 minutes early next week just to do a sound check. This is why I like sound checks. I hope to see all of you and your friends back again next week. We'll talk more later, and certainly at the end of the course, there will be plenty of time to discuss all that we've heard. But thank you for taking this trip through 19th century Europe with me.
Thank you very much, Rachel. This was wonderful. And yeah, we'll do a sound check next week.
Yes, great. Thank you so much.
See you next week, everyone.
All right, bye-bye.